tell me a little bit about the upcoming celebration and what role you're going to play in the event?
Well, I'd love to because it's very exciting, but it doesn't seem possible. We always say, how does the time go so fast? But it's been 30 years since that glorious day, November 11th, 1993, that we dedicated after 10 years of exhausting work to get all the final approvals for site and design. And so 30 years ago on November 11th, um, we're commemorating that with a commemoration celebration at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. It's going to start on November 10th, which is also my birthday, and it's the Marine Corps birthday I get reminded of frequently.
That's right.
November 10th, people will um, be in DC attending our events and at our headquarters hotel, the Hilton Garden Inn, Georgetown. There'll be a hospitality suite, and there'll be an event that's going to take place over in Arlington at the other Women's Memorial, the Military Women's Memorial. Vietnam Veterans of America is sponsoring that to honor women vets. Then that evening on the 10th, we'll have a candlelight ceremony. Now, we've done this every 5-year anniversary since 1993. So the candlelight ceremony is very spiritual. It's very sacred. It's 6:00 p.m. It's getting dark or is dark. And we have an opening ceremony by a Native American brother veteran who is Navajo. It's called a pipe ceremony. It's lovely. And then we have speakers, women speakers sharing their reflections. What does a Vietnam Women's Memorial mean to me? And that's ended with taps and, of course, a bagpipe, Amazing Grace. So that's for an hour, 6 to 7 p.m. And then Veterans Day, we have storytelling on site at the Vietnam Women's Memorial, right there at the statue. And we've invited speakers to share their stories, step up to the microphone. They have 20 minutes, more or less, and talk about their service, where they served, and also then, they refer to the statue, which is right next to them, and what this means to me. How has this helped with my healing? How has this helped me feel recognized as a Vietnam veteran? How has it changed my life? And how has it impacted my children, if there are children? Are they more proud now of their grandma, great grandma, to see, oh, grandma, is that you? Do you identify with that statue? Do you feel like it's part of, do you feel connected to it? So those kinds of things. And then at 1:00 on Veterans Day, we move to the wall. And at the apex of the wall, every year on Veterans Day and Memorial Day, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund with the National Park Service sponsors Veterans Day observance. And that's from 1:00 to 2:00 p.m. And then following that, there's presentations of wreaths. People from all over the United States come with a wreath presented at the wall. It's very beautiful. And then there's all these wreaths everywhere, remembering our brother and sisters who never made it home. And so that ceremony at 1:00 is also, it's music, it's speakers, it's tributes, and Veterans Day, as you know, is the day that we remember and honor our veterans. Memorial Day is the day we specifically remember those who died during the war. So Veterans Day, we celebrate the living. We also commemorate those who left us and sacrificed their lives. But this will be an opportunity for me, I'm the keynote speaker, to talk about, well, I'm writing my speech as we talk, I think, to talk about just what you asked, what has transpired in these 30 years. And I'll talk about that. And what has the Vietnam Women's Memorial meant to America, really, not just us veterans, but so yeah, that kind of wraps up the upcoming event.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I imagine that you still find it, I mean, just given how difficult it was, you must still find it hard to believe that, I mean, how do you think about like how does the way you feel about a 30th anniversary commemoration compare with the way that you felt at the dedication 30 years ago?
Oh, that's a good question, Michael. Yeah, let me think about that. Well, I can tell you exactly how I felt 30 years ago. My opening words, because I gave the address and then I emceed the program, of course, and we had wonderful speakers and we had music, and it was a celebratory event, not celebrating war. I've been criticized for that. How dare you celebrate war? I said I would never celebrate war. And this is not about that. It's about celebrating the honor and service and sacrifice of the men and women who served in Vietnam and during the war, served all around the world. It's commemorating their service and remembering and honoring them. So I opened it up because the day started out kind of gloomy and overcast, and the worst thing possible that could happen might be rain. Well, it never rained. But as soon as I started to speak, the sun came out. So I said, and the sun is shining on us. And I was just so filled with joy because I looked out on that sea of humanity, men and women, children, children propped up on the soldiers. Remember, we're all in our 40s now, many of us 50s. They have young kids. Some had grandkids already, but children propped, sitting on their dad's shoulders, and the flags were flying, and just the whole feeling of the National Mall just alive with anticipation that this Vietnam Women's Memorial, which was never going to happen because people said it'll never happen, and people said it's, forget it, you know, why even fight for it? They will never allow this, and there were reasons they said that. So we succeeded. So we were there to celebrate the fact that this statue, this monument, this memorial was the first in the history of the United States honoring military women on the National Mall. There were no memorials on the National Mall honoring military women. Ours was a first, and ours was Vietnam. And who, you know, better to remember during this time, since we now had the wall of names on the grounds of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, to also include the women, to have that opportunity to not only honor and remember our brother veterans, but to honor the women that I had served with and others who had served around the world. So the feeling of joy for me personally, to look out on the crowd and see the looks on, in particular, the women's faces, because it was a friend of mine who served with me in Vietnam. She said, Diane, years later, I looked at the video of our dedication celebration, and everybody looked like they were in shock. They had these looks on their faces of just almost fear. Many were crying. They looked stoic. They weren't laughing. They weren't joyful. They were just like anxious or anxieties. And I said, you know, I noticed that too. And I said, I think it was very appropriate. They really wondered we hadn't unveiled it yet. They hadn't seen it yet. It had been pretty much kept under wraps. I think it was a parachute that we used to cover the statue. And they knew there would be an unveiling of it. So I think this anticipation, and then the fear of coming out of the woodwork. I have now come to DC to participate in this, which now I am admitting I was even there. I haven't talked about it. I didn't want people to know I was even in Vietnam. What are people going to do if we march in the parade? Are they going to throw things at us like they did coming home from Vietnam? They just had this fear and this wonder, like, how are we going to be treated? Because coming home from the war was such a humiliation, filling us with this feeling of shame that we had even served in Vietnam. So I have to tell you, the reason I'm sharing this is the looks on their faces and their body language, and there was a lot of hugging. People were finally coming together and hugging. At the 25th anniversary, 5 years ago, I looked out, and women, now again, in particular the women, but the men too, they were joyful. They were smiling, they were laughing, they were happy to be there. They didn't have the look of fear on their face. They knew nobody was going to throw things at them by now. That's behind us. The country has changed their mind about Vietnam veterans, and now they are feeling guilty that that never should have happened. So 30 years ago, the crowd was very quiet, very solemn. And after the statue, we unveiled it, meaning several of us pulled off the shroud, parachute, whatever we want to call it. There was just this silence. People just looked like like they were in shock, like this can't be real. We women are actually being honored and recognized with a monument that is so incredibly beautiful. And I can't speak for everyone, but everyone I talked to said how much they loved it, that they loved the nurse tending to the wounded soldier. They loved the standing woman looking up for a helicopter, or God, which kind of the helicopter was God. God was intervening, bringing the chopper down to save lives. And then the kneeling woman. And interestingly, the comments that I got about the kneeling woman was that the women who served in the Red Cross, the donut dollies, for some reason, and they can explain this themselves, but they've told me that they identified with the kneeling woman very much. She was like every woman. And, you know, regardless of the uniform or the clothing that we were women. And we had the same feelings. And that was sometimes despair, sadness, reflection. That kneeling woman is reflecting on the day. She looks like she's either in prayer or she's tired. I say she looks like we all felt at the end of the day. And she is on her knees and she's holding the soldier's helmet. So there's been a lot of healing in a, if I can say a thumbnail synopsis here of what's happened in 30 years, is a whole lot of healing. And women, again, women and men too, coming to the monument for the first time, whether it was 10 years after dedication, I mean, there'll be people coming in, they've already told me, they're coming in on November 11th, and they have yet to visit the wall or the Vietnam Women's Memorial. They have never come to their memorial. And they finally are coming. And for them, it'll be a first. But, and so many women have told me they heard about the dedication in 1993, but they didn't come. They said they just couldn't. They just weren't ready. They just were terrified. And they had all these fears. And they still didn't want people to know that they'd even been to Vietnam. And they said, well, people might ask me questions and I don't want to talk about it. So they stayed home.
Yeah, I can't imagine what it's going to be like for those women who are there for the first time. It's probably the first time they've been in a crowd that large of women who did what they did, who experienced what they experienced.
That's right. And if what I learned about the wall, so beautifully designed and perfect, the wall is perfect in every way, designed by Maya Lin, is the power that a memorial can have in our healing. And of course, that's what a memorial is not effective. A memorial is not what it needs to be if it doesn't connect with the viewer or the visitor or the veteran. If we connect to that memorial and it makes us feel something that provokes this healing, which is it's something tangible that says we honor you, we remember those who died. And of course the wall does that in spades. And then when the statue of the three men went up, I could talk about that now, Michael, if you want me to, what my impression was of the statue of the three men.
No, let's come back to that. Let's come
Yeah.
back to that if you don't mind.
Oh, that's fine.
What you so you grew up the daughter of a nurse, right?
That's right, right?
Yeah. Your mother made a, I guess, a big impression on you because you also grew up to become a nurse.
She was my North Star. I worked with her. When I was 15, I begged her to let me work at the hospital. Well, she could pull any string she wanted. She worked at that hospital for 45 years and was the head nurse. And of course, she's now in her 40s when I begged her as a 15-year-old to work at the hospital. And I got a job the next day after school, as I was a junior and a senior in high school. I worked with mom at the hospital, and I also worked as a telephone operator with, back in the day when it was a switchboard.
Mm-hmm.
As that job paid me $1.25 an hour. A nurse's aide at the hospital paid me 50 cents. And I was saving my money so I could go to nursing school.
Wow.
So, so yeah, my mom was a huge influence in many ways, because working with mom at the hospital, that was a rural hospital in a dairy farm community. My dad was a dairy farmer. I grew up on a dairy farm, hardworking, with 5 siblings, all of us working on the, not only did I work in town, had 2 jobs, but I also had my chores on the farm. So it was going from one workplace to another. It was probably called child labor, but we didn't know it at the time. All we knew was we all had to pitch in, and pitching meant hay and manure. So, but what I learned from my mom, which I prayed for when I was in Vietnam, because I was only 21 when I went to Vietnam, was this was a rural hospital, and the nurses there did everything except go into the operating room. They went to the ER. They went to deliver babies. They admitted new patients. They worked on the wards. There was no ICU at the time, but there were critically ill patients. I would follow my mom. Mom would say, "Okay, Diane, we're going down. We're going to deliver this baby. The doctor's not getting here in time." And I watched her deliver babies because the doctors didn't get there in time. Then there was the emergency room, and Buffalo, Minnesota, where I grew up, had the train tracks that went right past the hospital. And back in the day, train intersections on farmland everywhere didn't have the gates that come down. What do you call those? They didn't have lights. You just had to look. You had to listen and look. Well, we had a lot of train accidents, a lot of deaths. We had farm accidents. We had drownings because Buffalo, Minnesota was surrounded by 4 lakes. Kids would come in having drowned. Some of them died, some of them we saved. Car accidents, alcohol related, because back then no seatbelts. People drove drunk because they could. So I saw it all. I saw a lot of trauma. I didn't see gunshot wounds and stabbings until I went to Minneapolis to nursing school, and then I saw a lot of that because I worked in the city hospital in that ER, and then every night was gunshot wounds and stabbings and trauma and violence. So I saw it a lot before I went to Vietnam. So I'm grateful to my mom, because what I saw her do, I learned how to do it, and that was with grace. My mom was always calm. I never saw her flustered. I never saw mom um, like she just had this confidence because she was so experienced. She just knew where the supplies were. She'd go grab a IV. She'd grab the drugs. She'd grab the supplies. She knew exactly what she was doing, and she brought calm to chaos. And there would be chaos in the ER, and she brought a sense of calm. And when I went to Vietnam, I the first week is like I would pray for, oh, please, can I be like my mother? Can I be calm? I'm praying for grace. And it worked. It did. It really did work. I was usually pretty darn calm when the
Hmm.
mass casualties came in, because you just quit thinking about yourself and your fear. You don't think about, I'm afraid to do this. You just get in and do it. And others watch you and others follow suit.
Hmm. So even then it was entirely possible to be a nurse in the army and not go to Vietnam. But you
Oh,
chose you chose to go to Vietnam.
Well,
As did every other woman who went to Vietnam.
no, that's not true, Michael. No,
No?
let's get the record straight there.
Okay.
Okay. So when us young nurses, most of us young, of course, we had nurses in their 40s and 50s, not to exclude anyone, but the majority of nurses in Vietnam were under the age of 25. So some of us volunteered to join the Army, knowing we wanted to volunteer for Vietnam. That was me. I went to an Army Nurse Corps recruiter, and I was a junior in college, and I said, I want to go to Vietnam as an Army nurse. And the recruiter basically said, well, here, sign on the dotted line. But I still was, how old was I? I forget, not old enough. And I had to get permission, I think, of my parents. So I went home and told them what I had done. But so I was accepted into the Army Student Nurse Corps program. And then this Army Student Nurse, the government paid, if student nurses would sign up to join the Army Nurse Corps, the government would pay us our tuition, our books, and a stipend. Well, that helped me for my senior year, especially because I'd only saved enough money to get through my junior year. And that was news to me. I didn't really know about that. So after I'm in the service, and I've been to boot camp, whatever you want to call it, for 6 weeks at Camp Bullis in Fort Sam Houston, Texas. They asked where I wanted to go, and I said, well, I'm joined so I could go to Vietnam, send me to Vietnam. But they sent me to Fort Lee, Virginia for a few months first. And then I went to Vietnam. I had volunteered. Now, you can interview a lot of nurses who will tell you they joined the Army Nurse Corps because they wanted to be an Army nurse, but they did not want to go to Vietnam. And they did not volunteer, but they got their orders for Vietnam. And so, of course, they went. So the truth is that women have never been conscripted. We're not drafted. So every single woman who's in the military is a volunteer. She volunteered to serve her country in the military. But they didn't all volunteer to go to Vietnam. But a whole lot of them went to Vietnam because they got orders.
I see.
And they went, and they stepped up, and they measured up, and yeah, it was so. So
Well,
one
that's
of
an
my
important clarification. I've been told, I mean, I don't just make this stuff up. I've been told by 100 different people 100 different times that every woman who was in Vietnam was there because she chose to be. I think
oh,
what they meant was
she chose to be in the
she
military.
wasn't drafted,
Yeah,
right? Yeah,
yeah.
but I think that you're the first person to make that distinction. I think it's an important one.
It's important because I've talked to so many women and they laugh about it now. And this one woman said, I joined because I wanted to go to Europe. And I just thought I was going to bicycle all over Europe. And it was like, we were young, we were naive. And another nurse told me I signed up for Hawaii, and I thought it would be guaranteed. I joined, and I want to, can I go to Hawaii? Well, maybe not. Maybe
Right.
Hawaii on your way to Vietnam. But
Yeah.
no, in all clarity, that's what I love about my sister veterans is that, and we'll talk a lot about this, I hope, and why it was so important to me to honor them, because they stepped up to serve and went where they were asked and did things they weren't qualified to do. And I want to talk more about that, doing things we weren't qualified for.
Well, let's
Just
talk about that. Let's talk about the kinds of things that you saw women do, things that you did, but also things that you saw other women do, and what impression that made on you in that situation. I mean, Vietnam's a long way from Buffalo, Minnesota.
well, and then that helps answer your earlier question, Michael, that you had asked me maybe off camera about why was it so important to me to build this memorial to honor women veterans? What drove me to that? Why did I give up 10 years of my life to make sure that they were remembered and honored? Well, because in Vietnam, so many of it, I was 21 and the average age was 23. We were the youngest female nurses to ever serve during wartime. And when, again, I want to clarify something right now. When I'm talking about nurses, we have male nurses. There's a lot of male nurses out there, and 3 of them are my nephews. They're awesome.
Hmm.
And but when I talk about female nurses and women, the Vietnam Women's Memorial is to honor nurses, but all women. The statue of the three men honors the men. So the male nurses would be part of the statue of the three servicemen.
Hmm.
The whole concept of my mission was to honor the women, and 80% or almost 90% of the nurses in Vietnam were of the women in Vietnam were nurses, and another 15 to 20% were male nurses, not to forget them.
Yeah. Okay.
But okay, so back to Vietnam and why I was so proud of the women that I worked with for 1 year, and I was in two places. We can talk about the 36th Evac, which was my first assignment on the South China Sea, and then I requested a transfer and went to Pleiku, which was near the Cambodian border. And women nurses, now again, I'm talking about us, were assigned a specialty. Mine was surgery, med surg, not in the OR, but surgical post-op and pre-op care of the wounded. Somebody has to take care of them pre-op, somebody has to take care of them post-op. That was my job. So many women who had never had, well, a little bit of operating room experience in their school of nursing stateside, if they'd had any, maybe had 3 months of just a taste of what it's like to be in the OR, but they weren't trained OR nurses. They get to Vietnam and they put them in the operating room immediately. And I know one of these nurses who had serious PTSD years later because of this. And she said, Diane, I had no experience in the operating room. They throw me in there and I'm just supposed to know everything and what to do. And the casualties are coming in. This was in Pleiku, where we had enormous casualties coming in 69, especially in March when the 4th Infantry Division got hit so hard. And she said, I was terrified. I was terrified. I didn't have any confidence. I had no skills. I had to learn on the job, and I was screamed at by doctors and other nurses, and she measured up. She finally learned and developed the skills that she needed to feel good about herself as a nurse. But it created a serious post-traumatic stress disorder for her later, after she had returned home, and her ability to practice nursing in an operating room again. So because we were so young, Michael, and we were asked to do things that we had no experience with, we had to overcome our fears, and we had plenty of them. What would we do when some soldier's life came in and depended on me, and there nobody else there? We were it. My own experience at Pleiku was, as I was now 22, was times in my unit and mass casualties, the only person that soldier had was us nurses. The doctors weren't there. They were all in the operating room. We had our medics, our amazing, wonderful medics, who I loved every one of them. And, but I like to say it depended on how smart we were, how brave we were, how quick we were, and just having this enormous energy, because we're young, so we had the energy, and get that adrenaline pumping, and just not focus on ourselves. But that the most important person in the room was not the nurse. The most important, well, she was important to the, but we never saw ourselves as the most important. The most important people in that unit were the patients, and we forgot about ourselves and took care of them no matter what. And that no matter what included being rocketed and mortared and getting patients under their beds. And, you know, when their bloodlines got pulled out and their IVs got pulled out and they were on chest tubes, we couldn't get them my patients were on respirators, we couldn't get them under the bed. So the mattresses that are now empty because that other soldier has dived for the floor to get under the bed, we took that mattress and threw it on the men who couldn't get under the bed. Did we go for cover? No. We were on duty. We didn't run to some bunker unless we were off duty and there were enough people on duty, but I never went to a bunker. I stayed in my unit. I never left my unit. I stayed with my patients. And this whole notion about, well, women can't be in combat because they're shrinking violets. They'll just, the men will all be there to protect the woman. That's laughable. The men weren't protecting me one little bit. I was protecting them. That was my job. That was the nurse's job, to protect our patients. So I saw heroism. I saw heroism every single day. And I saw a lot of women who should have gotten the Bronze Star for heroism, but they did not. And a few did, and God bless them, that did get, awarded a recognition for their heroism. But women don't deserve medals. They were just nurses. They're just doing their job. That was told to me. Nurses are just doing their job. And I said, well, those operating room nurses, they all deserved the Bronze Star for valor. During those moments where they had mass casualties and they were on their feet for, sometimes 30 hours, bathroom breaks was about it. And they were true heroines, but there was no recognition for them then or when I came home from Vietnam. And that's a whole nother story. Not only lack of recognition, but being set up for humiliation. So I was so proud of the women I served with, because we didn't complain, because we'd say the guys are out in the boonies sleeping on the ground and they're wet and they're dirty and they're cold or they're too hot, or they're miserable. We have a dry bed to go home to, and we had a shower. It was a cold shower, but we had a shower. So we didn't complain. That was the other thing about not complaining. We just did our jobs. But I was really proud of the women I served with.
Yeah. Your book is full of, very vivid examples. There's and I'll let readers discover these for them, or listeners discover these for themselves by reading your book. But there's the story of you and a medic and a flashlight and 28 patients, which is just a remarkable story. So I won't ask you to tell that here, but can you talk a little bit about some of the examples that from the book, of things that you saw other nurses do that inspired you?
Again, being in Vietnam, we were assigned a unit award depending on where the needs were, what needs needed to be met. And the emergency room at Pleiku, we'll just talk about Pleiku right now, because we were right in the thick of the battles. Unlike the Vung Tau, the 36th evac was on the South China Sea. It was beautiful. It doesn't mean that hospital was not attacked, because it was. But oftentimes the choppers that came in were bringing wounded from other hospitals. And the whole concept of evacuation was stabilize them, move them to the next staging area, either the flight home, the $1 million wound, the air evac chain, and the Air Force flew them off and to Guam or Hawaii or home. And then there was the in-country evacuations. And when I was at the 36th evac, a lot of our patients came to us, what I said, in blue pajamas. They'd already been somewhere else, but they needed further care. They needed surgery. So they needed pre-op and post-op care. And some of these guys were going to go back to the field because their injuries were not that significant that, okay, we're going to take out their stitches and send them back to the field. And the 36th evac was a 400-bed evacuation hospital to do just that. And sometimes the patients came right out of the field there as well. Of course they did. But now when I requested a transfer, I told the chief nurse I wanted to go north. I said, I want to go to where the fighting is. I'm ready. This was after 6 months. She said, well, be careful what you ask for. Then I'll send you to Pleiku, Rocket City, near the Cambodian border. And the 4th Infantry Division was getting hit really, really hard. And we had mass casualties frequently. And the enemy, the VC, the NVA, targeted our hospital many times to take out the hospital, take out the radar, which was right next to the hospital. So our emergency room was like a conveyor belt of patients coming in by dust-off helicopter. And I was assigned to a pre-op and post-op surgical unit. So, but if the casualties were coming in, and my unit was quiet because we were waiting for the next batch to come in, and we'd already evac one, you know, a whole bunch of soldiers casualties out. I would leave my one nurse in the unit, because there was two female, in my case, it was two female nurses, and then my four medics, and that was it for the 44 beds. I would go to the ER to help out. And I'm telling you, those ER nurses, they were just, I would help out. So I was one of them, and I was doing what I could because I had enough skills by this time to do everything that needed to be done in the ER. And that's get the IVs started, get their clothes off, check their bodies for wounds, make assessments, decide where they're going to go next. Are they going to go to the OR? Are they going to go to the a unit, an appropriate unit where they would be transferred for whatever skill-based needs, nursing needs they needed, orthopedics, what have you. So just the stamina and the compassion and the care and the concern, and no matter what that body looked like, because they'd come in with battlefield amputations. Of course they did. And they came in missing arms and legs. They came in missing parts of their face. Plus injuries to their torso, bullet holes everywhere, burns. I mean, it was everything. I mean, everything that you can imagine that war inflicts on the human body. And every single one of those patients was treated so tenderly and spoken to, and you're going to be all right now, you're safe. Of course they weren't. Nothing was safe in Vietnam, and our hospitals were attacked, and the emergency room was too. And it just, I never thought about it at the time, because yeah, we were just doing our job. That's the nurse's job, and the docs and the medics and the teamwork. I loved Vietnam for the teamwork. I never saw that stateside afterwards. Not like that. Everybody's
I don't know a thing about nursing, but I would think that, if you defined the nurse's job, it would have more to do with the medical technical things. If you can do all that and be kind and be compassionate and be respectful and all that, that feels to me like above and beyond, right? Maybe that's what makes a great nurse versus just a nurse. I don't know, but
well, none of us were just nurses in Vietnam.
You're all very, very capable, right?
Yeah.
This is hard work that you're doing, often dirty work and sometimes heartbreaking work.
Well, it was life-saving work no matter what, and it was heartbreaking work to see all these young men so broken. And what were they going to live for? Without both limbs and both legs gone, and just the tragedy and the sadness, and we felt that, and we'd come back to our hooches. We called them at Pleiku, we called them hooches, hooch mates, but that's not liquor mates. Hooch is liquor, but it's kind of funny because I've said, well, I would say Edie was my hooch mate, and we're still friends. And what'd you do? Drink together or something in Vietnam? I said, no, the hooch was the building we lived in. Right. But we'd go back to our hooches, and most of the time we didn't talk about what we had done that day. But there were times that the agony in our faces and the sadness in our faces, but still we didn't debrief. We really didn't express our emotions. We just sucked it up and accepted it and got up in the morning and did the same thing over and over and over again. But also when, we did triage in the ER and determined who needed to go to who would go to surgery next. And there's a whole set of protocols for triage on a war zone that are different than triage in the United States. And if the patient was going to require a long time in the OR and there were mass casualties, you didn't start with that patient, because you would be working 10 hours on that patient while all these other casualties are waiting. So if that patient had the shortest amount of time possibly to survive, he would be put probably behind a screen or somewhere, in the ER. And the nurses, all of them, it was like they didn't want anyone to die alone. So someone would be there with that person. And that happened to me one night at the 36th evac. my unit was quiet that night. And I talked about this in my book too. So I got a tap on the shoulder, and the head nurse in ICU had called me to come and sit with a patient who was going to die. They didn't want him to be alone because he was still lucid. He was still talking. And he definitely wasn't going to survive more than 8 hours. And I don't know if it was 6 hours that I sat with him, and I just held his hand, and I couldn't see him because his face was wrapped with dressings. He had head injuries, and parts of his body were also wrapped with dressings. He was just from head to toe. It's amazing that he survived at all, but the cut downs, to get in albumin and intravenous fluids and then blood if necessary. And so I just went up to him and started talking to him, and I knew he could hear me, and he squeezed my hand, and I just said, "I'm not going anywhere. I just want to sit with you tonight." And then I decided I wasn't just going to sit there and hold his hand, but so I talked to him the whole time. And I just found things to talk about. And I said, "Okay, well, I don't know where you're from. I wish you could tell me, but I'll tell you where I'm from." And then I told him about growing up on a farm and having horses and how nice that was. And I just kept talking so that he would be comforted. And his hands started getting colder and colder, and I would feel his pulse, and it was weaker and weaker, and his blood pressure had dropped dramatically. And I knew I was going to lose him. He was going to be mine that night. And I was all he had, Michael. I was it. It should have been his mother or his wife or his girlfriend or a brother or a sister with him. But it was me. And that haunted me for years. And I was really angry about it. That this young man, he should have had someone who loved him deeply there to comfort him. And then I thought, well, he had me, and I loved him in those moments. And I think all of us would admit that we don't want to die alone. And every soldier in Vietnam, I would say, did not want to die alone. That's why their buddies would stick with them, because the buddies knew they didn't want to die alone either. And they got so close to each other. And the buddies would come into my unit to visit someone from their platoon. And sometimes it would be their officer, their CO, sometimes their platoon leader, their sergeant. Enlisted and officers would come and go in our units all day long to visit the wounded. And that meant so much to them because it was somebody that cared about them. It wasn't their family member. We were family. We were their family. And so when I was angry at God for allowing all this carnage to happen, because we have to blame somebody, so why not blame God, right? He's supposed to be in charge. And why can't he just send us all home and say the war is over? But that's another story I can share later about my epiphany with that whole thinking. And but there I was with him. And so I wanted it. I knew he died before his mother did and his family. And I felt sad about that this young man's gone. His family's going to now get the telegram or the visit after they quit just sending telegrams and made the visits by car. And women, men, and I think mostly men made those visits to tell the family the sad news.
Being a female nurse in Vietnam, you faced mortal danger, right? You yourself were in danger, even if you weren't technically in combat. And in the face of that danger, you had to perform an incredibly technical and life-saving work. So you had all of these things that you had to deal with that were not so different from what those boys had to deal with. They also had to do incredibly technical work under just horrific circumstances. But one thing that you did have to face, and maybe it didn't happen very often, but you had to have your guard up all the time, because one thing that you did have to face that those boys never had to face was predation from people wearing the same uniform as you. Do you want to talk at all about the, not personal experience necessarily, but just about that as a phenomenon? I mean, what was it? 200 and some odd thousand women served in Vietnam, out of 3 million total.
Well,
The
Michael,
rest were men far from home.
I'll correct you there, because what you just said is something often thought because of our statistics when we came out as a Vietnam Women's Memorial Project to educate the public. The 265,000 women who served, that was during the era around the world. And the era of Vietnam, as you know, being that 10 years, but they've expanded that now. Like, did it really start in 1946 or did it start in 1956? Or the 50th war commemoration talks about, what is it? Is it 63 to 73 or is it 65 to 75? But what was really the Vietnam War, depending on who you talk to and what you read. But for the entire war itself, approximately, and we never could get exact numbers. So we say the estimate is approximately 10,000 women served in Vietnam.
What did I say?
You said 200,000 in Vietnam.
Sorry, that's 200,000. Yeah, you're right. 200,000 was worldwide at the time.
Right.
Right?
265,000. Yeah, just clarification. Right. Thanks, Michael.
But regardless, I mean, it only makes my, it only makes my point even more.
It does. And no, we do need to talk about it. And I'm glad you asked the question, because we do need to talk about the exposure of women in the military then and now. And I've talked to World War II women who are mostly gone now, who also experienced sexual assault, sexual harassment, and rape. Wherever there's women in a war zone and wherever there's men, wherever there are predators. And it's no different than in the civilian life and civilian world. What happens in the civilian world happens in the military. Thank God the predators are few and far between. We do need to talk about sexual harassment, sexual trauma, and rape in the military. It's happened in all the wars. If you read the history, you know that. And personally, I've talked to World War II women who have told me that they themselves or colleagues were raped or sexually harassed or assaulted in some way. So, and it's still happening today, as we know, and the military is taking steps and Congress has taken steps to abolish it, but it's never abolished. And it doesn't seem to be getting a whole lot better for women in our military today. It's a huge problem and it's a huge issue. So thankfully, the predators are few and far between, but there's enough of them to damage and hurt huge numbers of women serving then and now. I know women in Vietnam personally who were raped. I know some who were assaulted and some who were harassed. It's often by senior officers who take advantage of a lower ranking woman. And so, yes. And so that's another reason why I fought so hard to honor women veterans through the dedication of the Vietnam Women's Memorial, is because we stepped up to serve. And some of us were victims of criminals in the military. It's a crime. And nothing was done about it. And I'll tell you why back then in the 60s and 70s, Michael. Back then in the Army Nurse Corps, they didn't have the protocols or the, what do we do about this? A nurse would come to the chief nurse and say, I was raped. Well, oh, are you pregnant? Well, we'll send you away. Or the nurse herself would choose to have an abortion wherever she could get one, sometimes in country, and sometimes going to Japan, and sometimes just going home. And that was devastating to the woman because her career could be over, ruined, damaged. Sometimes she was blamed. Well, you shouldn't have been there. Were you drunk? So the blame was put on her. And so the psychological damage and that went along with all of this and ending your career like that. And sometimes the way of dealing with this was, well, we'll transfer you out. So they transferred the woman out to a different location instead of actually dealing with it and putting it in a court, a neutral court that could, deal with this. But no, it would be under the commander's decision. The commander would decide what to do with the guy who was the rapist. Well, we'll send him to a different place too. So oftentimes the rapist was never caught and was never convicted.
Mm.
So yes, we dealt with that. We dealt with some sexual harassment. And I think most of us, and we talk about this still now, most of us women, we just stayed silent. We talked to each other about it. We had our secrets. We watched our back. And we just dealt with it in our own way. And to protect ourselves and to protect our jobs. And all of us knew that this wasn't the majority of men. The majority of men that I served with in Vietnam, and this is why I say, I was so hurt coming home from the war. I saw how the men were treated when they came home, and I had just seen how they had suffered and died. I had seen their heroism. To me, they were as heroic as any World War II, Korea, any veteran. My patients and the heroism when they stepped up out in the field to protect each other, and they're the one that gets hit, and they come in, and the guy protecting them was killed. And the heroism among these guys and what they went through, but it was also among us women. And so, after the World War II generation was named the greatest generation, this is what I started saying, and I still say it. There's greatness in every generation, and there is greatness in our generation. And I've seen that greatness in the women I served with and in the men I served with. And so I just felt like I've been feeling ever since Vietnam, like I need to defend us. I need to defend my sister veterans. I need to defend my brother veterans because I saw their heroism. I saw not that we're all heroes, because we're not. What I saw was strength and endurance and service and caring about each other. And then those predators, they just, they ruined it for us. They did. They attacked us, and we had to live with the guilt and feeling like maybe it was our fault, like we should not have been at that party.
Mm.
Personally, I avoided alcohol in Vietnam because I saw that and I avoided doing any kind of drugs. I wasn't judgmental. It's each to their own. Everybody had their own way of dealing with the war and the trauma of it. And but my way of dealing with it was, I liked going to the parties, but I didn't like being around alcohol, that I didn't want to be around intoxicated people. It was my fear, and fear of drug use and not having I didn't want to be impaired. So some used drugs and alcohol and some did not. We cannot be painted with the same brush. But yeah, there are many Vietnam veteran women and women today that suffer PTSD from the trauma of the predators. So yes, we need to talk
And
about it.
and short of harassment, assault, rape, there's just the day-to-day treatment of women. I mean, you were as a nurse, you were an officer in the United States Army. I wonder if you feel like that, like as a lieutenant, were you treated like any other lieutenant in the Army, or were you treated differently because you were female?
Well, I can share this with you, Michael, in that when I joined the Army Nurse Corps, I knew I'd be a lieutenant because we had to have our degree. So we'd been to college, we had our RN, And if we had a master's degree, maybe we went in as a first lieutenant or a captain, depending on our experience and our degrees. And that we would be making more money than the average enlisted person. But what I discovered after Vietnam, working in a military hospital and at Fort Lee, was the enlisted women who were not officers, enlisted women, okay, in the Women's Army Corps. I was appalled at how they were treated. And I felt like it was so unfair. Well, why are us, if we're officers and we're nurses, why are we treated with more respect? Or, and people do tend to treat nurses with respect overall, always have, always will. We're nurses, right? And I have to share with you, my older brother, who was drafted in 1965 and went to Korea, we thought he was going to Vietnam. When he found out I volunteered for Vietnam, he was furious. When I volunteered to be in the Army, he said, "Diane, you can't be in the Army. They treat the women like," finish my sentence, okay?
You can feel free to finish it. It's
They
okay
treat
here.
women like shit, is what my brother said, because he was enlisted. He was a PFC. And he said that you'll be treated terrible. It's awful how they treat women. And what he had seen was how enlisted women were being treated.
Mm.
And my oldest brother, who was now out of the service, he was in the airborne, he said the same thing. He was horrified. He didn't want me to go either. He said, "Diane, don't do it." And so I have two older brothers who think that women in the military are mistreated. And now their sister is going. And so
That's interesting that I mean, I asked a question about the disparity between a male lieutenant and a female lieutenant, and you are saying that's the wrong, like what you're more shocked by is the disparity between a female lieutenant and a female sergeant in terms of how they're treated.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Wow.
And the grueling things they made them do, like, like making the beds and getting in trouble if the bed isn't perfect and their boots aren't shined. Us nurses, they couldn't even teach us how to march. We thought it was a joke when we were in basic training. The platoon said they wanted to teach us how to march, and we laughed about it because we said, we were actually giggling with each other. Hey, we're only 21. Like, when are we going to march? And so we would actually get out of march formation and do twists and turns and go there. He'd say left and we'd go right. We thought it was a joke.
Hmm.
And nobody ever looked at our shoes to see if they were polished. And it was just a different world for us nurses anyway than those
Yeah.
women. So yeah.
One of the things about your book that really struck me was that it never occurred to me before was that when you were practicing as a nurse in a war zone, you were treated with respect, not just by your patients, by the doctors. They knew you were capable and they needed you to be capable. And so they allowed you to do whatever was needed. And then when you came home, right, and we can talk, you feel free to talk about your experience of homecoming. But the thing that struck me was you went to work in a civilian hospital and they wouldn't let you do anything.
Oh, that is so true. And I wrote about it in my book. It was just demoralizing. Now, remember, I came home in 69. The whole country, it's demoralizing. The war protests and the burning of buildings and the burning of the flag and just the denigration of our service, and like it was our fault, and what did we go there in the first place, and the awful things that were said to us if they found out we were a Vietnam vet. So I didn't want anybody to know I was there because it just set myself up for humiliation. But on my application to work at North Memorial Hospital in Minneapolis, where I wanted to work because it was the trauma center, they were just starting trauma hospitals back then. And so they put me on a ward, which was gallbladders. It wasn't trauma. It was gallbladders and appendectomies and the usual post-op surgical things. And it had been on my application that I served in Vietnam, but that didn't matter. And when there was an order to start an IV, I started it. And
And
oh
how
my,
dare you? How dare you start an IV?
so the other nurses tattled on me. She started an IV and she's just brand new. And so the head nurse found out, and she comes up to me and she said, "Miss Carlson, you have to be observed 3 times before you can start an IV on any patient in this unit." Well, what I wanted to say, but I couldn't, was that, ma'am, I've started more IVs in 1 year than you will start in a lifetime. I started 28 IVs in the dark while our hospital is being attacked with a flashlight with one medic, and they're all going to die if they don't get this IV because they are hypoxic. I wanted to just blow it off in her face and tell her off.
Yeah.
And I said, yes, ma'am. So I was observed 3 times so I could start IVs. The next thing I did that I got in trouble for was it said, the doctor's order said, this patient needed an NG tube. Well, that's a nasogastric tube, and you put it down through the nostril and you hook it up to a pump and it sucks out the gastric. So I did it. I went and put down the NG tube. Oh my God, that was even worse. The head nurse comes back, Miss Carlson, don't you know through orientation, you don't do those. The externs, I didn't know we had externs. The externs do those. The nurses do not do those. And I was like, yes, ma'am. Okay. So now I'm there 2 weeks, and I know this is not gonna, I can't work like this. So there was a patient who had her varicose veins stripped. Varicose veins, okay, right? This is not major invasive surgery. But it was 10:30 at night and her bell was ringing. She wanted help, but I couldn't get there because I was about to give report. And so I finally did get there, and she wanted hot chocolate. And it's like, what, you want hot chocolate now? It's the kitchen is, yes, you can get it from you. You've got some hot chocolate. Just go get some of that hot water and bring me. Well, she reported me to the head nurse that next day and said that I was incompetent. I hadn't answered her light, that I refused to bring her hot chocolate when she wanted it. And the head nurse said, this patient is very litigious. We happen to know that she has been in other hospitals and she has sued. And I thought, she's got legs. What is she going to sue about? I had patients in Vietnam that didn't have legs and didn't even complain. The next day, I went to HR and said I was resigning. And she said, you've only been here 2 weeks. And I said, well, I've decided to go back into the Army Nurse Corps. And you know what she said to me? Well, it's in the book. I cannot forget this ever. She looked at me. First, she looked at my face, and then she looked down, down, down till she got to my feet. And then she looked back at my face and she said, well, you don't look like you'd been in the Army. It was a derogatory. You don't look like you'd been in the Army. Like a woman in the Army should look like what? She didn't say thank you for your service. Oh, you've been to Vietnam. Thank you for your service, or you've got all these great skills. We wish you'd stay and continue working with us so you could help teach our younger nurses some skills that you have developed in a war zone. Not a pleasant word out of her mouth. So I went to followed my hooch mate, and in her new Barracuda, and me and my new Cougar. She bought
I
a Barracuda.
love that image. I wrote that was one of my favorite parts of the book. Was that 69 Cougar and that 70.
And we followed each other out to Madigan Army Hospital, and I got a job there as a civilian nurse immediately, and did all the things that I ever did in Vietnam. Then they assigned me to a post-op surgical unit. I started the IVs, I did the NG tubes, I did everything at Madigan Army Hospital because the Army Nurse Corps or the military hospitals respect our skills. And then I thought, what am I doing working here as a civilian? I'm going to go back. So I rejoined the Army Nurse Corps. I was out by now. I'd done my 2 years. And I thought, what am I doing working as a civilian in an Army hospital? So I went back in, and then I went to Brooke Army Medical Center. And then my roommate was Edie, who was my hooch at Madigan Army Hospital. Edie had been my hooch mate in Vietnam. So Edie and I had stayed in touch with each other, and Edie had called and said, Diane, I haven't finished my tour. I have to do another year, and I'm going to Madigan Army Hospital. And I said, I'm going with you. It's the best thing I ever did. It really saved me from I'm sure I would have been in a real depression if I know I would. I was mildly depressed already, but work was my saving grace. Work saved me. I loved my work. I went down to Fort Sam Houston, Texas, and immediately the chief nurse looked at she said, "Hi, hello, Captain. Welcome back into the Army." And I said, I'm still a first lieutenant." She said, "No, I just promoted you. You're a captain now." And she said, "Where do you want to work?" And I said, "Do I have a choice?" And she said, "Well, where do you want to work?" I said, "Well, I want to work in ICU. That's what I do." And she said, "Good, because you're going to be head nurse in the ICU, report up to 13A. So I was not only head nurse in ICU, but also the recovery room and also the post-op ward. It was a big job, but I loved it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they knew you could handle it because you drove up in a 1969 Mercury Cougar, and they were like, wow, whatever she wants, give it to her. That's one of the most beautiful American cars ever made, I think, that particular year.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
it must have been so fun to drive out to where was that? Was it California?
Yeah. And Edie, my hooch mate, was from Minnesota and I was from Minnesota. So
Mm,
we bonded like in 2 minutes. No,
mm,
2 seconds we bonded. She was assigned to play crew about the same time I was. And we happened to be door to door with each other in our hooch.
mm,
And "Where are you from?" "Minnesota, Minnesota." It's like, oh, I have something in common with her. And
mm,
she's hysterically funny. I told you about the first night we were rocketed, and I was crawling around on my hooch floor with broken glass because the mirror, there were no windows in our hooch for obvious reasons. There were boards and screens for the mosquitoes. But the mirror over this makeshift dresser blew off the wall and crashed on the floor. So I'm crawling over glass now because the mirror broke into a million pieces. And I unlocked my door and banged on Edie's door, and Edie opened it up. And I said, "Well, Edie, if we're going to die, let's die together." I really said that. And she was under the bed, and she had her helmet on over pink curlers because she curled her hair at night, had rollers in her hair, back in the day, those pink rollers. And I laughed. We were laughing. We're being rocketed. It's horrible. We could have died. And the hooch next to us was blown off the face of the map. Right next to us, that hooch, which was empty.
mm.
And I laughed. I said, "Edie, you should just see yourself." And she said, "Well, thank God I can't." And she was eating peanut butter and crackers. I said, "Edie, how can you eat at a time like this?" "Well, if I die, I'm not going to die hungry." And then we laugh again.
Mm.
So we are laughing and we're being rocketed, we're being attacked, and it's terrifying. We were terrified, but we had each other. And again, I keep going back to that in Vietnam. We had each other, and us women had each other just like the men had each other. We had each other's backs. We may not have talked a lot to each other and debriefed and cried. We never, I never, I never saw, Michael, I never saw a nurse cry in Vietnam. If they cried, they did it alone in their hooch. But we didn't like sob on each other's shoulders. We just didn't. I didn't see any crying. I saw sadness and maybe a few tears, but not any like sobbing, like we can't do this or we're scared. We just, but we're so young too. Maybe we think we're immortal, but how can we feel immortal when we're being bombed, rockets and mortars and shrapnel all over the place? But there again, just that's why I just love these women. Um, and we came from every kind of background. I mean, I was a farm girl from Minnesota, dairy farm. Edie's parents were in Minneapolis. She was a city girl, and her dad was a corporate guy, an executive in a corporation. A lot of the women were Catholics. I was Lutheran. So we came from every state across the United States, and some of us were Jewish. We were all religions. Some of my friends were gay and lesbians, and some of the nurses, male nurses, were gay, and they were my friends, and they were awesome nurses. And when they got found out, they disappeared. And I did ask the chief nurse once, "Where are the guys? They're not back from R&R. Where are they?" And the nurse said, head nurse said, "You didn't hear?" And I said, "Hear what?" I'm so naive. "Hear what? Like, does this matter?" That I had a cousin who I knew was gay and it didn't matter to any of us. said, well, they got kicked out. Why did they get kicked out? Because they're gay. I said, you mean they can't be in the military anymore? She said, no. If you're found out, you will be discharged. I didn't ask if it was honorable. I don't know if it's honorable or dishonorable, but back in the day, that's what happened. And I just thought it was so unfair. And I knew of gay women. And boy, did I keep my mouth shut. It's like, what if they find out? And we protected each other. That's what we did.
Well, and
Military.
the thing that I find so just surprising is, you know, we've done episodes. We did an episode on nurses. We did an episode on donut dollies, and both of those episodes, you know, we got more mail from those two episodes probably than any other episodes we've done, and most of it was men who served in Vietnam saying, thank God for these women, you know, these women." And so when I read in your book that men who were there, men who were treated by U.S. Army nurses, were against the idea of a memorial, not for aesthetic reasons, not for, you know, some high-minded reason, but just because they were dismissive of women as deserving of a place of honor for their service. That was such a surprise to me, because I've never heard a man express that, you know, but apparently they're out there, and you know, and they weren't even the biggest surprise that the surprise adversary that you faced in your fight. So I would like to get into that story, and I would like for people to understand what it took. I mean, Jan Scruggs got, you know, I mean, the wall was a 3-year battle, but that's lightning quick compared to what you had to go through.
I think that 10 years is really important, Michael. So I'd be happy to do another segment if you would like, because I think it talks about and it addresses the social and cultural climate in America then and probably still now regarding women, because there's still patriarchy, there's still misogyny, there's still racism, there's sexism, there's all of that. But above all of that, Michael, what I'm going to conclude here is that when all the bad guys came out and said these really terrible things about why not, women don't deserve this, they didn't carry a gun, they weren't in combat, come on, what did they do? Thousands and literally thousands of men came to our rescue and wrote letters to the editor and wrote letters to congressmen and women when we went through the legislative effort. Now that's part 2 of your interview.
Mm-hmm.
What we had to do to work around the naysayers and the antagonists was the men came out of the American Legion, men in the American Legion mostly got behind us. The VFW, of course, Vietnam Veterans America was totally behind us, and the disabled American veterans. So that was a minority that you've just talked about, thankfully, but they were the vocal minority. They were the loudest because they came out in the beginning and they wanted to just stop us. So they demeaned my character, my reputation. I was this woman coming in and out of the cornfields. They took that was said about me. They also said I was a radical feminist using the Vietnam dead to further my cause. And I was like, what? I wasn't a radical feminist. I didn't burn my bra and wear see-through blouses. I wore combat boots in Vietnam. That maybe that makes me radical, but it was like they demeaned me personally. They demeaned my service. And you know, the more angry they made me, the harder I worked and pushed back. And I said to myself, I'll show them. And I did, because I didn't quit. Perseverance overcomes resistance was kind of my motto, but I couldn't quit because they were bad guys with bad words, and and they just didn't know who we really
Well,
were.
I mean, in a way, you know, I don't agree, but I have the benefit of hindsight. But in a way, I can sort of understand how Maya Lin would look at that wall and say, you know, that she's opposed to the addition of statuary in general, right?
Correct.
But I can't understand what happens when a man says, "Oh, I'm in favor of the three servicemen statue because I don't think Myelin's point about the aesthetics is valid. So let's get this three servicemen statue in here." And then you bring up the idea of a women's memorial. Well, they've already kind of said that they have no problem with statuary in concept. So
That's
what's
right.
left for them but to say, "Oh, it's because women don't deserve it," or "Oh, it's because women are already represented." Well, so are men, right? I mean, just the amount of hypocrisy and mental gymnastics that people are willing to go through to avoid being exposed as hypocrites. And we're all hypocrites, right? I'm not pointing any fingers, right? Hypocrisy is the human condition, but the mental gymnastics that people have to go through to rationalize their position is fascinating to me. Why wouldn't you just say, look, we've already established that there's a place for statuary near the wall.
Well, we did that.
Yeah, you
My
sure did.
testimony, I worked hard on my testimony, and it was what I realized overall, Michael, was that people really didn't know who we were, what we had done, and
Mm,
and what our contribution really was.
mm,
And I needed to educate them. And so it was all about stories. And so we hired a publicist, and we can do this in the next uh, part if you wish.
mm,
And her job was to, through us, because we identified these women through Sister Search now, is get these women, encourage these women to share their story with the public in newspapers all across the United States. So we started a clipping service back in the day when we could do that. The
mm.
clippings came in from all over the country. And say in Nebraska, that's a good example. We found a woman veteran for them. And so the Nebraska, some newspaper calls me and says, well, we want to interview so and so. So they did. And then her story came out in the newspaper, and it was like this local woman, what she had done in Vietnam. And her story was just so profound. And then now the male veterans are reading this, and they write a letter to the editor, and they say, if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't be alive to write this letter. I support this memorial. These women deserve it.
Yeah,
And so that was a strategy that worked, and that was education to who are the women, how are they doing now, and what did they do anyway in Vietnam. So they didn't
yeah,
carry a gun. Well, our weapons of war were not, our instruments were, our weapons. We didn't have weapons. Our instruments of war were the stethoscope and the hemostat and the tourniquet and the bandage scissors and IVs, and we used life-saving measures. That was our job. We weren't asked to take lives. We were there to save lives. And so all of the above, which really changed the climate. But there are other things too that contributed to the reversal of the obstructionists and why we won. And that was finding good allies. And out there's a lot more male veterans than women. And when those men came out of the woodwork and stepped up to support us, like we had done for them in Vietnam, the tables turned.
mm,
And I think the naysayers had to go around with a tail wagging behind their legs. And I don't think they've been to the memorial. I think they avoid it.
mm.
Maybe they feel a little guilty. I don't know.
Yeah.